Imagine this. A cold dawn settles over Port Royal, the air thick with fog, as if the sea itself is warning of what's to come. Somewhere out there, beyond the mist, sails a fleet of warships, their cannons loaded, their orders clear: hunt down Blackbeard and erase his legacy from the sea. But this isn't just another pirate story. This is the memory of a cursed night, when betrayal whispered through the crew, when fear crawled beneath the skin of men who had once called each other brothers, and when the Queen Anne's Revenge became more than just a ship. It became a floating confession of every bad choice, every broken oath, and every drop of guilt that clung to Blackbeard like the mist. What really happened that night, on the shores of Isla Fiebre? Who stood their ground, and who ran when the fog rolled in? These aren't just legends, they're the whispered truths hidden in the pages of the pirate's diary. If tales of pirates, lost oaths, and cursed gold stir something in you, the sea keeps its stories, but only for those who dare to remember. Will you join the crew, subscribe, and step aboard? The moon that night was a broken thing, shattered into pale fragments scattered across the sky, as if even the heavens had grown tired of watching men like us prepare for what we knew would come. Blackbeard stood at the edge of the shore, staring at the dark line where sea met horizon, his eyes hollow but burning, like he was already somewhere else, maybe in the past, maybe in the end he already knew was waiting for him. The sand beneath our boots was wet, thick like mud, heavy like regret. The air smelled of salt, old iron, and something else, something bitter, like the scent of promises never kept. Behind us, the jungle stayed silent, holding its breath like the rest of us. Ezra, our quartermaster, the only man with enough courage or foolishness to speak, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "We could still make it out, Captain. Take the East Channel before sunrise, slip through before their ships close the trap." For a moment, just a single long heartbeat. Blackbeard didn't answer. Then, with a voice that rolled low and slow like a storm, still deciding whether to break, he said, "Running is for men who plan to keep living. That's not who we are." His words didn't need repeating. Not one of us moved toward the boats. We knew what they meant. So, we sank them, one by one. We dragged our own lifeboats into the shallows, cut holes in the bottoms, watched them fill with seawater like coffins made of wood and rope. It wasn't about bravery. It was about choice, about forcing our own hands, making sure no one among us could wake at dawn with second thoughts. The cannons, buried. We dug deep into the sand at low tide, turned the beach itself into a trap. Places where a man's weight could shift the earth, send metal and fire roaring upwards. Ezra marked the spots with broken bottles and driftwood, subtle reminders that death now lived beneath our feet. The women, the children, they were sent inland. No time for goodbyes, no time for soft words, just a few whispered directions and silent prayers as they disappeared into the caves that twisted like veins beneath the island. No one, not even the boldest among us, spoke of victory. There was only one word being passed from mouth to mouth, soft, heavy, and dry as gunpowder: endurance. We would stand until the tide chose who stayed and who never left the island at all. And above it all, in the middle of the beach, Blackbeard remained there, motionless, staring at the horizon like he could already see the sails of our hunters cutting through the mist. A man waiting, not for a fight, but for the debt he knew the sea had been keeping for far too long. Dawn never really came that morning, only a pale, bruised light that crawled over the waves like something wounded and slow to die. The soldiers landed before the sun could rise, their boots slicing into the shoreline. Each step loud, enough to wake things that should have stayed buried. They moved in tight ranks, muskets raised, eyes sharp, but none of them ready for what waited beneath the sand. The first shot didn't come from a rifle or a shouted order. It came from the earth itself, a hidden cannon, buried just beyond the driftwood line, roared to life with a sound that tore the air apart. The ground trembled. 5 men were lifted clean off their feet, their bodies thrown like broken dolls into the cold surf. The scream that followed was short, lost beneath the weight of the sea and the crackle of gunpowder still lingering in the breeze. From high above, on the jagged edge of a rocky cliff, Blackbeard stood watching, silent, unmoving. His pipe rested between his teeth, the smoke curling around his face like a second skin, a dark veil that made it impossible to tell if he was smiling or mourning something none of us could see. At his side, Helena waited, the best shot we had, her hands steady as stone. Her breathing slow, like she wasn't preparing to take a life, but to bury one. She adjusted her musket with the kind of care a priest might give to a final prayer, each movement slow, deliberate, like part of a ritual she'd performed too many times before. Below us, the soldiers scattered, confusion spreading faster than fear. Some waded back into the shallows, others dropped behind the dunes, firing blindly toward shadows that weren't even there. And still, Blackbeard said nothing. He simply exhaled, letting the smoke drift past his lips, watching the chaos unfold like a man witnessing the final chapter of a story he'd written long ago, with ink made of regret and promises he'd never keep. The hours after the first shots felt like something pulled from a nightmare that refused to end, the kind where time stretches, and the air grows heavier with every breath, until even your own heartbeat feels like betrayal. The soldiers thought they could push forward, cut their way through the mangroves with bayonets and torches, but the island wasn't just earth and roots. It was something else now, something alive, something that had learned to hide its fury in every shadow and every patch of tall grass. They marched in tight columns, shouting orders that dissolved into the humidity, trying to look brave, trying to sound in control, but the jungle listened and answered in silence. One by one, they began to disappear. No cries for help, no gunfire, just absence. A soldier would pause for a drink of water, and when his officer turned back, he was gone. Another would step off the trail for just a second, maybe to adjust his gear or answer nature's call, and never return. Branches shifted, leaves trembled, but when they fired into the trees, nothing answered. We didn't strike in waves. That wasn't Blackbeard's way. We used patience, hunger, fear. The blade from behind, the shot from somewhere unseen, the whispered laugh in the dark that made even the bravest of them quicken their step. By midday, the soldiers had lost their formation. Some moved in scattered pairs, others stayed frozen behind trees, waiting for orders that would never come. Then they found the clearing. In the center, an old oak stood, crooked and scarred by lightning from some forgotten storm. Hanging from its lowest branch, a white flag, swaying gently, as if mocking them. Beneath it, 2 of their own, bound with seaweed, hands twisted behind their backs, mouths filled with wet sand like some cruel joke from the ocean itself, their uniforms stained, their faces pale and still. No blood, no struggle marks, just the message: you're not welcome here, and this is only the beginning. For a long while, none of the soldiers dared move closer. One officer crossed himself, another simply turned and vomited into the dirt. High above, from a rocky ledge masked by vines, Blackbeard watched them, his expression unreadable, his pipe forgotten between his fingers. The man who once faced down entire fleets now stood in silence, studying the slow unraveling of his enemy like a chess player moving pieces only he could see. He knew the truth. None of us spoke aloud. His crew was tired. Their faces were thin, eyes sunken, bodies bruised from nights spent hiding and running, weeks of sleepless watches and salted rations, the weight of too many defeats, too many empty graves left behind on too many forgotten shores. Yet, none of us hesitated. Even with blistered hands and hollow stomachs, we stayed, not because we believed in survival, but because there was nothing left for us on the other side of this fight, this island, this stretch of cursed earth and tangled roots. It wasn't just a battlefield. It was where every broken promise, every buried regret, every name we could no longer remember had finally decided to come back for us. And Blackbeard, he stood there, staring at the soldiers below, knowing full well that by the time the sun fell again, some would vanish without a trace, and others would wish they had. By midday, the island had turned into something close to a furnace. The air, thick, unmoving, pressed down on us like a giant invisible hand, squeezing the breath from our lungs with every step we took. Even the mangroves, usually damp and cool beneath their canopy, now radiated heat like iron left too long in the fire. Sweat burned our eyes, our clothes stuck to our skin, and for a while, it felt like the island itself wanted us gone, wanted us buried, just one more layer beneath its cracked soil and twisted roots. That's when Samuel broke. He was the youngest of us, barely old enough to shave, still clumsy with his blade, still too green to carry the kind of scars the rest of us wore on the inside. 2 days earlier, during a failed raid on a merchant sloop, his older brother had gone down in the surf, swallowed by the sea before anyone could pull him back. We all heard Samuel crying that night, thought he'd pulled himself. Together by morning, but the cracks were already there, spreading, waiting for the right moment to split him wide open. And under the choking weight of the sun, that moment finally came. It happened in the middle of the fight, while shots rang out from both sides of the jungle, while the British soldiers pushed deeper, stepping over their own dead to gain another few yards of cursed ground. Samuel stumbled out from the tree line, his face pale, hands trembling, dirt and sweat smearing his cheeks, like war paint drawn by fear itself. He crossed the distance toward Blackbeard, weaving like a drunk, almost collapsing at the captain's feet. "I can't! Captain! I can't do this anymore!" His voice cracked, thin and broken, like a rope fraying with each word. "I don't want to die here, not like this, please!" The air around us seemed to freeze. Even the men closest to the fight stopped for just a breath, turning to watch. The sound of distant gunfire faded, replaced by the slow, dragging pulse of silence. Blackbeard didn't move at first, didn't raise his voice, didn't curse. He just looked at the boy, long and hard, with eyes that had seen too many men reach this point, eyes that didn't carry anger anymore, only the cold understanding of how these things always ended. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, dry, almost like he was speaking to himself, or to ghosts none of us could see. "We all die here, boy. The only difference is when and how." Without another word, he reached inside his coat, pulled out a battered old revolver, the kind with a cracked handle and a history no one wanted to ask about. He handed it to Samuel, slow, deliberate, like passing down an inheritance no one wished for. "Decide for yourself." Samuel took the weapon with shaking hands, eyes wide, breath shallow, as if the weight of the iron alone could drag him under. No one followed him when he stumbled back into the trees. No one called his name. We all knew better. By sunset, the fight had pushed further inland, and when roll was called that night, his name stayed unanswered. Some said they heard a single shot from deep inside the jungle. Others believed he simply kept walking, further and further, until the island swallowed him whole. But for those of us who stayed, fighting, bleeding, holding the line we knew we couldn't hold forever, Samuel became something else, a reminder. That on Isla Fiebre. The first thing to break wasn't the body. It was the will. Night didn't fall. It collapsed. 1 minute, the sky still burned with the last traces of daylight, bleeding orange and gold across the waves, and the next, darkness swallowed everything, thick and sudden. Like the island had decided enough light had been wasted on men like us. The soldiers, desperate now, driven more by fear than by orders, began to shift their assault toward the southern edge of Isla Fiebre. They thought they'd found a weakness, a narrow coral path, barely visible, exposed only during the lowest tide, a forgotten back door, winding through jagged rock and slick stone, leading toward the caves we used to hide the women and children. What they didn't know was that Blackbeard had seen this coming hours, maybe days before they even stepped off their ships. He'd sent Ezra down there, the quartermaster with the burned hands and the smile that never reached his eyes, carrying barrels, black powder, oil-soaked rags, everything needed to turn stone and salt into a grave no map would dare mark. We watched from the cliffs as the first line of soldiers moved single file along the coral, their boots slipping, rifles held high to avoid the spray of the waves, their voices low, whispering orders as if the darkness might overhear. When they reached the mouth of the cavern, they paused, peering inside, seeing only blackness stretching forward. And that's when Ezra moved. He crouched low behind a fallen boulder, a length of twisted rope coiled between his fingers, the fuse already soaked and ready before lighting it. He glanced back toward Blackbeard, high above, barely visible against the night sky. For just a second, the two men locked eyes, no words, no signals, just understanding. Ezra struck the flint. The spark caught fast, racing along the fuse, a hungry line of fire slithering into the belly of the earth. For the space of a single breath, there was silence. Then, the island lit up from within. The explosion didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like the bones of the world, breaking apart. A wall of light burst from the cavern mouth, turning rock and sea spray into burning shrapnel. The air igniting with heat so fierce it left the skin raw just from standing too close. Men, dozens of them, were thrown backward, lifted from the ground and scattered across the shoreline like driftwood after a storm. Some vanished beneath the waves, others never moved again. Their silhouettes burned into the stone walls like shadows that would never leave. The sound rolled out over the water, a deep, hollow roar that carried far beyond the island's edge, reaching the decks of the enemy ships anchored offshore, where even the most hardened captains stood frozen, unsure if they'd just witnessed battle or something closer to a curse. Ezra, standing by the smoldering remains of the fuse, wiped the sweat and soot from his face, grinning with that crooked, half-broken smile of his, the kind that told you he didn't expect to survive the night, but was more than ready to see how far he could push fate before it took him. Blackbeard, high on the cliffs, watched the smoke curl into the stars, and for the first time that day, he closed his eyes, like a man offering a silent apology, not to the living, but to the sea itself, for what we had just done. On the far side of the island, where the jungle thinned and the sand turned coarse and grey, Helena stood alone, her rifle pressed tight against her shoulder, eyes fixed on the figures moving just beyond the tree line. A small group of soldiers, no more than 5, had broken away from their ranks, deserters, their uniforms torn, stained with salt and earth, hung loose on their frames, as if even the fabric wanted to abandon them. They stumbled over roots, dragging themselves forward, hands raised high, muskets thrown to the ground like dead weight. One of them, barely 17 by the look of him, collapsed onto his knees, choking on sobs, his voice cracking through the air. "Mercy, please, I don't want to die here." The words hit Helena harder than any cannon blast. Her finger hovered over the trigger, but her hand, steady in battle, began to tremble now. In the boy's face, pale and streaked with dirt, she saw another face, from years ago, from a time she'd buried deep enough to forget, or so she'd hoped. Her brother, smaller than this boy, but with the same wide, terrified eyes. She remembered the day they pulled his body from the harbor, lungs full of seawater, fingers curled as if reaching for air that never came. Another casualty of a faceless captain, a forgotten skirmish, a decision made far from the decks where it mattered. And now, here she stood, rifle raised, staring at a stranger begging for the same mercy her brother never had. The jungle around her stayed silent, no wind, no bird calls, just the shallow, desperate breathing of the men waiting for her choice. Her mouth opened, but no words came at first, just air, shaking and thin. Then, finally, she found her voice, hoarse, cracked, more a command to herself than to them. "Run," she whispered. The deserters didn't hear. She cleared her throat, forcing the words out with the last of her resolve. "Run. Tell them what you saw. Let them know what waits for the next who sets foot here." The boy blinked, for a second unsure if the order was real, then scrambled to his feet, dragging the others with him. They bolted toward the shoreline, tripping over roots and stones, too panicked to look back, too grateful to question their luck. Helena lowered her weapon, her hands still shaking, her breath shallow and ragged. Behind her, through the break in the trees, high on a distant ridge, Blackbeard stood watching. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but she knew he'd seen everything. For a moment, she braced herself for his voice, for the weight of judgment she'd learned to expect, but it never came. Instead, he simply stared at her, a long, unreadable look, heavy with resignation, as if he, of all people, understood the kind of ghosts that clung to a person after choices like this. Then, slowly, he turned away, disappearing back into the trees, leaving Helena alone with her thoughts, and with the echo of her brother's name still lingering somewhere in the back of her mind. By the time the sun hung low and red above the treetops, there were barely 30 soldiers left standing. Their uniforms, once crisp and proud, now hung loose and stained, torn by branches, salt and fear. Faces hollowed and eyes sunken, yet still, they pushed forward, dragged forward by the voice of one man, a captain whose name would stay with us long after the island fell quiet. Captain Graves, a man whose obsession ran deeper than duty, deeper even than hate. He wasn't there for glory, or pay, or orders written on parchment miles away. He was there for us, for pirates, for Blackbeard. We'd heard stories about him long before this night, tales whispered from port to port, about a man who hunted pirate crews not for medals, but for the satisfaction of seeing them broken, one by one. Now, here he stood, battered, but burning with the kind of fire only obsession can feed. When Graves realized his men were too few for strategy, too scattered for flanking, too scared for patience, he did the only thing left. He ordered a charge, a full, desperate, reckless sprint, straight toward our central camp, through the trees, over the dead, into the teeth of whatever was left waiting for them. We barely had time to react. There wasn't enough powder for everyone, not enough shot, not enough steel. Some grabbed machetes, others axes pulled from fallen trees, some with nothing else. held broken bottles like they were swords blessed by the sea itself. We stood, shoulder to shoulder, breathing in each other's fear, each other's sweat, waiting for the crash. And when it came, it was brutal. Bodies collided, steel against bone, screams torn from throats too dry to carry them. The ground turned slick beneath our boots, and still we fought. Every swing, every stab, every desperate lunge felt like the island itself was shaking beneath our feet. Ezra went down first, taking 2 soldiers with him, teeth bared like an animal refusing to die quietly. Helena, blood streaked across her face, fought with the butt of her rifle when the barrel cracked in half. Men screamed names we'd never know. Soldiers called for orders that would never come. And through it all, like a shadow moving through fire, Blackbeard stood, unmoving, until Graves reached him, the captain, driven by fury, by months of planning, by sleepless nights imagining this single moment, lunged with his saber, the blade trembling in his hands, eyes wide, like he was chasing something more than just victory. Maybe redemption, maybe revenge, or maybe just the end of the chase that had eaten him alive from the inside out. Blackbeard didn't flinch. He caught Graves' wrist mid-strike with a single controlled movement, like swatting away an insect that had finally dared bite, their eyes locked. For just a second, everything around them fell silent. The battle, the screams, the burning trees, the broken oaths, all of it paused. Without a word, Blackbeard drove his own blade forward, slow, deliberate, never breaking eye contact, as if forcing the man to watch every inch of steel sink into him. Graves gasped, a soft, stunned sound, more disbelief than pain. And when Blackbeard finally let go, the captain crumpled to the ground, folding over himself, like a man who had carried too much for too long and had finally been allowed to drop it all. The fight didn't last much longer after that. The soldiers, seeing their leader fall, hesitated, then broke apart, running, crawling, dragging themselves toward the jungle or the sea or anywhere that wasn't here. And us, we stood among the wreckage, bleeding, breathing, and knowing deep down that this was only one more chapter in a story none of us were going to survive for long. The battle was over, but the island didn't feel like it. What remained wasn't victory. It was silence, a heavy, metallic silence, thick enough to choke on, pressed down over the trees, the shoreline, even the air itself. The kind of silence that makes men hold their breath, because somewhere deep inside, they know the worst part isn't what already happened, it's what comes after. The beach, once alive with shouts and gunfire, now stood still, scattered with weapons, broken gear, and the bodies of men who would never leave this place. Ezra moved first, his boots dragged through the blood-soaked sand, the grin he wore during battle now gone, replaced by something quieter, something hollow. He stood beside Blackbeard, wiping dirt from his face with the back of his sleeve. A few soldiers, no more than 3 or 4, had managed to slip through during the chaos, swimming toward a small rocky islet barely visible beyond the waves. From this distance, they looked like shadows crawling over water, slow, desperate, broken. Ezra spat to the side, then spoke in a low voice that barely carried. "Want me to take a few men, go after them, drag them back, finish this right?" For a long, stretched moment, Blackbeard said nothing. He stood there, sword still hanging at his side, his coat torn, hands scraped raw, staring at the clouds rolling over the horizon, thick and dark, like the sky itself had grown tired of watching. When he finally answered, his voice wasn't sharp, wasn't angry, it was slow, dry, like the words weighed more than he could carry. "Let them go." His gaze stayed fixed on the distance. like he was speaking to the sea, not to Ezra. Let them carry this, like a plague, in their memory. Ezra hesitated, then gave a small nod, stepping back without another word. Nearby, Helena stood with her back against a tree, her hands covering her face, shoulders shaking. No one went to her. No one spoke her name. We all understood. Tears, on this island, didn't come from fear anymore. They came from the kind of grief that carves itself into bone, the kind that stays long after the wounds stop bleeding. Some of us began to collect what little supplies remained. Others started digging shallow graves, too tired to argue, too broken to care if the tide would wash them away by morning. Blackbeard didn't stay to watch. Without another word, he walked alone toward the shoreline. His steps slow, like every inch of distance between him and the water was a burden. When he reached the edge, he took off his hat, that old weather-worn thing he'd carried through storms, raids, and more deaths than any of us could count. For a second, he stood there, holding it in his hands, staring at it like it was the last piece of himself he still recognized. Then, with a slow, almost reluctant motion, he threw it out to sea. The waves took it, pulling it under without ceremony, without pause, as if the ocean had been waiting for it all this time. And Blackbeard, he just stood there, watching, while behind him, the island kept its silence, and every man and woman left breathing, tried to figure out what parts of themselves had survived and what parts never would. That night, there were no songs, no cheers, no drunken laughter spilling from campfires, no clinking of bottles raised in victory, just the slow crackle of dying embers and the restless hiss of waves dragging splintered wood and forgotten bodies back to the shore, as if the sea itself wanted to reclaim what little remained. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and something else, something bitter, like regret baked into the sand. Blackbeard sat alone on a cold slab of rock overlooking the surf, his back hunched, shoulders heavy, the kind of weight a man carries when he's lost more than he's willing to name. The others kept their distance, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Some buried the fallen, others packed what supplies they could salvage, but no one, not even Ezra, dared disturb the silence that hung around the captain like a second skin. Gabino, the closest thing Blackbeard had to a brother, approached quietly, a bottle of rum tucked under his arm, the glass slick with condensation. He knelt nearby, placed the bottle at Blackbeard's side, and after a long, reluctant pause, spoke barely above a whisper. "We held the island, Captain. We won. But..." His voice cracked, the words tangled with exhaustion. "What did we lose along the way?" For a long time, Blackbeard didn't answer. He stared at the foam gathering between the rocks below, eyes distant, as if watching some unseen battle still raging out on the horizon. When he finally lifted the bottle, his hands moved slow, fingers bruised and scraped, trembling only slightly, the way they always did after too many days without sleep and too many nights haunted by names he no longer spoke aloud. He took one long drink, wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve, and before the shadows fully swallowed his face, he let out the words, dry, low, more for himself than for any man listening. "Maybe the last part of us worth saving." No one replied. There was nothing left to say. By dawn, the island stood quiet again, the sand, smoothed by the tide, washed clean of footprints, as if none of us had ever been there at all. Isla Fiebre, a name that, from that night forward, sailors refused to speak without a shiver running down their spine. Some who survived left the sea for good, settling in faraway ports, refusing to even glance at a map that showed this cursed stretch of land. Others, like Ezra, carried the memories with them, drinking just enough each night to blur the edges, but never enough to forget. As for Blackbeard, some said they saw him again, weeks later, standing alone at the bow of the Queen Anne's Revenge, staring toward the setting sun, as if looking for something he'd never find. Others claimed he never left the island, that even now. On certain nights, if the wind shifts just right, you can still hear the low rumble of his voice drifting across the waves, carrying the weight of everything left unfinished. The truth? Maybe it doesn't matter, because stories like this, they don't end. They just settle, like salt in the air, like scars under the skin, waiting for the next poor soul willing to listen. Did you already know this forgotten part of the story? And if you had been on that shore, staring at the enemy, hearing your own heartbeat louder than the cannons, what would you have done? What other sea stories, buried by time and fear, deserve to be told here? If this story touched you in any way, don't let it vanish like so many other names the sea has taken. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep hearing what was never meant to be forgotten.